February the 7th, 1968, just after midnight. 5 Soviet-built tanks grind up a jungle trail toward a camp of 24 Green Berets who have never faced armor in this war. A trip flare ignites. Steel treads flash green in the sudden light. 2 North Vietnamese soldiers kneel in the wire, cutting a path for the machines behind them. In a wooden watchtower above the camp, 24-year-old medic Sergeant Nickolas Fragos presses his eyes to the dark and freezes. He keys his radio. "We have tanks in our wire." Below him, men reach for a weapon most have never fired at a moving tank. A shoulder tube called the Law, built to stop armor at close range. Tonight, it will decide who lives. Behind those 5 tanks, North Vietnamese infantry move through the dust the treads throw up. Behind Fragos, a colonel who arrived that morning for a courtesy visit is about to become the last line of defense the camp has left. By dawn, this camp will be gone. What happens between now and then? The tube that keeps misfiring in men's hands, the reinforcement that will not come for hours, and the one radio call that finally changes everything, is a story the U.S. Army buried in an after-action report for years. He would carry the memory of that first flash of green steel for the rest of his life. Nickolas Fragos was not supposed to be a fighter. He was the assistant medical specialist of Detachment A-101, 5th Special Forces Group, the man who patched up bullet wounds and treated fevers, not the one who hunted tanks. But Lang Vei had a way of turning every job into the same job: survive the night. The camp sat in the northwest corner of Quang Tri Province, in rugged, densely wooded terrain 1.5 miles from the Laotian border. 8 kilometers to the northeast stood the Marine Combat Base at Khe Sanh, close enough to hear, far enough to matter. Highway 9, a major east-west road, ran right past the wire. This was the second Lang Vei camp. The first had been overrun by North Vietnamese infiltrators the year before, its commander and executive officer both killed. The replacement camp, finished in September 1967, was supposed to be stronger. Better fields of fire, thicker bunkers. Nobody had planned for tanks. Its commander, Captain Frank C. Willoughby, ran a strike force of roughly 500 men, Bru tribesmen, Vietnamese regulars, and combat reconnaissance platoons under the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program. 14 Vietnamese Special Forces soldiers and 6 interpreters worked alongside his 24 Americans. For anti-tank defense, Willoughby had 2 106mm recoilless rifles and 100 M72 Laws, light, disposable, and, as the night would prove, unreliable. Willoughby had laid his defenses with care. Company 101, 82 Bru tribesmen, held the northeastern flank. Company 104 covered the south. Companies 102 and 103 anchored the west, 450 meters away. Reconnaissance platoons filled the gaps between them. Every position was ringed with barbed wire, claymore mines, and trip flares. On paper, it looked like a fortress. In practice, it was 500 lightly armed irregulars and 24 American advisors waiting to find out what the enemy actually intended. By late January 1968, the warning signs were already stacking up. Khe Sanh village had fallen. Refugees streamed into Lang Vei by the thousands. Laotian soldiers, mountain tribesmen, civilians with nowhere else to go. until nearly 8,000 non-combatants crowded in around a camp built for a fraction of that number. Survivors of an overrun Laotian battalion arrived with stories of enemy tanks. On January 30th, a North Vietnamese deserter confirmed it. A reconnaissance team had studied Lang Vei's defenses 2 nights earlier, mapping exactly where the heavy weapons sat. Willoughby believed Khe Sanh was still the enemy's real target. He was wrong, and he was about to find out how wrong at the worst possible hour. What he could not have known was that 8 kilometers away, at the Marine Combat Base he was counting on for artillery support, commanders were fighting a siege of their own and would soon have to decide in the middle of the night how much they were willing to risk for a camp that was not theirs to defend. Because the North Vietnamese army was not planning to bypass Lang Vei. It was planning to erase it, and to do it with a weapon no American Special Forces camp in Vietnam had ever been forced to answer. The 5 PT-76 tanks, now grinding toward the wire, were about to make history. Not the kind Willoughby's men wanted. February 6th, the day before the attack, gave Willoughby every warning he needed, and still not enough time to act on it. In the middle of the morning, a mortar barrage slammed into the camp without warning, wounding 8 Vietnamese soldiers. In the early evening, 50 rounds of enemy 102mm artillery fire crossed over from Laos, wounding 2 more men and heavily damaging 2 bunkers. Through the night that followed, radiomen kept logging strange noises beyond the wire, and trip flares, one after another, igniting in the dark for no visible reason. Picture it. You are standing watch on that perimeter, the jungle pressing in on every side, and every few minutes another flare hisses to life at the edge of your vision, and nothing is there. Or is there? The camp's defenses were not improvised. 2 106mm recoilless rifles covered the roads in from Laos. 4 57mm recoilless rifles, 1 per company, sat behind more than 3,000 rounds, most of them deadly canister shot. 19 60mm mortars ringed the perimeter. On paper, Lang Vei could answer almost anything short of an armored assault, because nobody had built this camp to stop tanks. Nobody had needed to until now. Willoughby had no way to know exactly where or when the enemy would hit. As a precaution, he radioed an alert to the Marine base at Khe Sanh, a few kilometers to the northeast. If the North Vietnamese came, he expected the big guns there would make it costly for them. He believed that. He had reason to. What he could not know was how long it would take those guns and the men behind them to actually respond once the shooting started. If you've made it this far into the story of Lang Vei, you already sense where this is going. And you're right, too. This channel exists to tell the stories the official record leaves half-finished, the ones declassified only decades later. Subscribe, and you'll never miss the next one. 2,700 Laotian soldiers and their families had already streamed into Lang Vei days earlier, refugees from a camp across the border that had been overrun by tanks. Willoughby had heard their stories. He had filed the warning away. Now, on the night of February 6th into February 7th, that warning was about to become his reality. At exactly what hour, no one in the camp could say. Only that it would come from the south, up the Lang Vei road out of the dark, and that when it did, the 100 laws stacked in Lang Vei's bunkers would be tested against Soviet armor for the first time any American Special Forces camp in Vietnam had ever faced it. Fragos finished his rounds through the dispensary near midnight, checked on 2 of the wounded from that morning's mortar barrage, and climbed the ladder to the watchtower to relieve the man on duty. He had done this 100 nights before. He had no reason to think tonight would be any different, right up until the moment it was. The wire held nothing back. It never had. Just after midnight, 5 PT-76 tanks broke from the tree line at Lang Vei and came north up the narrow trail toward the wire. 2 platoons of North Vietnamese infantry followed close behind, wearing steel helmets, weapons ready, moving in the dust, the treads kicked up. The trip flare ignited. Fragos saw them first. His warning went out over the radio, and Lang Vei's defenders opened fire in the same instant the enemy did. Captain Willoughby ordered every gun he had turned on the breach at Company 104's sector, where the lead tanks were already grinding through the wire. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Schungel, the Company C commander who had arrived the day before on what was supposed to be a routine visit, raced up from the operations center and stared in disbelief at a tank's main gun firing point-blank into an American bunker. At the 106mm recoilless rifle, Sergeant First Class James Holt worked alone, loading and firing as fast as the weapon allowed. A sergeant named Tirak ran to help him load one last high-explosive round. Holt traversed, aimed at a third advancing tank, and fired. Direct hit. The tank stopped dead, but not before its gun had already destroyed 3 American bunkers. Out of ammunition, Holt ran for the team house. He was never seen alive again. At almost the same moment, another PT-76 came tearing up the Lang Vei road at full speed, ground to a halt at the wire breach, and fired point-blank into the camp's second 106mm recoilless rifle position, destroying it instantly. A second tank joined it. Together, they rolled forward into the Company 100 area, their machine guns raking anything that moved. Down in the operations center, Willoughby was fighting a different battle, getting the Marine artillery at Khe Sanh to answer. Because Khe Sanh itself was under fire that same night, and its headquarters wanted to know the size of the force attacking Lang Vei before committing rounds, the first friendly artillery did not land until the fight was already 15 minutes old. 15 minutes. In a night that would decide who lived, that was the gap between a plan on paper and the truth of what was actually happening inside the wire. By Oro 100, a forward air controller and a flare ship had arrived overhead, and fighter aircraft were inbound. It was help, but it was help still minutes away, and the tanks were already inside the camp. By the time the shells finally began falling around the camp's perimeter, 2 more tanks had already rumbled through the breach, destroyed a recoilless rifle position, and pushed into the heart of Company 104's ground. The Camp Willoughby had spent months reinforcing was being torn open in real time, and the men still standing were about to find out that the only weapon left to stop the tanks now was the one that kept failing in their hands. Colonel Schungel had by now collected whoever he could find. Lieutenant Paul Longreer, the Vietnamese operations officer, Lieutenant Quai, Willoughby's executive officer, Lieutenant Miles Wilkins, a radio operator named William McMurray, and Sergeant Fragos. Arming themselves with laws, they fanned out in two-man teams and went hunting for tanks in the dark. Schungel fired first and missed. He and Fragos dropped prone near the operations center and kept firing until their laws ran out. Tracers from a North Vietnamese machine gun snapping green light over their heads the entire time. Fragos crawled to the nearest mortar pit, grabbed 4 more rockets, and dragged them back by their carrying straps. He kept 2 for himself. Moving clear of Schungel to avoid the backblast, Fragos shouldered a law, aimed at a tank 75 meters out, and fired. The weapon clicked. Misfire. He threw it aside, grabbed the second, fired again, and the round buried itself in the dirt short of the tank's tracks. Too short. He scrambled back toward Schungel, just as machine gun fire tore up the ground he had been standing on seconds earlier. This was the truth about the law that night. For every rocket that worked, at least 1 more failed, misfired, fell short, or simply did nothing to the armor it was built to stop. Men were dying to find that out in real time. A rocket finally struck home. Someone put a round into the tank, pressing toward Company 104, immobilizing it. Its main gun answered anyway, firing point-blank into the command bunker from 15 meters away. The blast blinded McMurray and mangled both his hands. It buried Wilkins under a collapsed wall of sandbags. It threw Schungel flat, stunned, a fragment tearing into his hip. North Vietnamese infantry rushed the position through the smoke, firing as they came. Lieutenant Quai stood his ground and emptied his rifle into them, reloading as fast as his hands would move, and broke the charge. Schungel, dragging the ruined McMurray behind a stack of sandbags, turned to see a second tank rolling in from the west. He ran forward, threw 2 grenades under it. A law round struck it in the rear in almost the same instant. The hatch flew open, only flame came out. As the crew of a second stalled tank tried to climb free, Schungel killed each man with his rifle as he emerged. It was 8:30 in the morning, and Lang Vei's fight had only reached its middle. Schungel and Wilkins, both wounded, pulled back to the team house rather than risk being trapped in the open. Above them, North Vietnamese soldiers were already moving through the camp in small, scattered groups, no longer an assault force, but an occupation in progress. Inside the deeply dug command bunker, 8 Americans, most of them wounded, held on with the last of the camp's Vietnamese and CIDG soldiers around them. The tank assault had already collapsed both entrances. North Vietnamese soldiers began digging in against the bunker's outer wall, the scrape of entrenching tools audible through 6 feet of dirt and concrete. Grenades came down the stairwell every few minutes. Most did nothing. Some did. Just after EO 600, a thermite grenade rolled into the darkness and burst into white fire, igniting the maps and papers scattered across the floor. Then came tear gas, the first used in the fight. The defenders hugged the ground where the air was thinnest, coughing, some of them vomiting, passing the camp's few gas masks hand to hand. A voice called down in Vietnamese, "Surrender, or the bunker comes down." The Vietnamese camp commander and his men went up the stairs and out. What happened to them next, the Americans below could only guess at from the gunfire and the screaming that followed. Was there ever a version of that morning where staying below ground was the wrong choice? Or was it the only choice that kept 8 Americans alive long enough to be found? Willoughby never answered that question the same way twice. At Nord 6:30, the wall gave way. An explosive charge tore a 6-foot hole through the north side of the bunker, and for the first time all night, the enemy had a straight, unobstructed path to the men trapped inside. At the old Lang Vei camp, a mile from the fighting, 3 Americans had spent the entire night trying to get someone, anyone, to send help. Sergeant Eugene Ashley, Sergeant Allen, and Specialist Johnson had been turned down once already by the Laotian battalion commander stationed there. They held him to a promise: troops at first light. At Da Nang, the question of a relief force was still being argued. The Marines at Khe Sanh, fighting their own siege and wary of losing helicopters and men to an operation outside their perimeter, had decided not to risk sending a reaction force into Lang Vei. The camp, as far as anyone at headquarters could confirm, had already fallen. Would you have made that call sitting at Khe Sanh, watching your own base come under fire, weighing your remaining aircraft against a camp you could not yet confirm was still holding out? The Marine commanders who said no that night believed they were making the only responsible choice available to them. General William Westmoreland, the overall commander in Vietnam, was in Da Nang that morning when he learned of the decision. He overruled it on the spot, ordering the Marines to provide helicopters for a 50-man Special Forces strike force regardless. But that order would take time to become helicopters in the air. Ladd, the Special Forces Group commander, and Anderson, commanding the 1st Marine Air Wing, were told to build a rescue plan from scratch in the middle of an active battle for a camp nobody could say for certain was still fighting. At Lang Vei's old camp, Ashley was not waiting for any of it. As the sky turned gray, he went back to the Laotian commander a second time. After an hour of arguing, he had roughly 100 armed men. Through an interpreter, Ashley told them plainly they were going to retake the camp and pull out whoever was still alive inside it. He called in airstrikes to soften the objective, formed the scratch force into a skirmish line, and gave the signal to advance, his radio strapped to his back. Allen on the right flank, Johnson on the left. They walked into what had been Company 101's position past the dead, gathering stragglers still capable of fighting as they went. The first assault reached the outer bunker line before North Vietnamese fire broke it apart. So did the second. So did the third. By the fourth attempt, Ashley had counted only 9 defenders left standing between his men and the operations bunker where Willoughby's survivors were trapped. One more push, he believed, would be enough. He had no way of knowing he was right, or what it would cost him to prove it. The fourth assault pushed further than any before it. Ashley's ragtag force of Laotians and American-led stragglers broke through the bunker line and reached the mortar pit closest to the operations center, close enough, finally, to see it. Then Ashley fell. A bullet passed through his chest and through the radio strapped to his back. North Vietnamese soldiers still had plenty of fight left in them, and the attack collapsed for the 4th time. Allen and Johnson dragged him clear of the fire and back to a waiting jeep. As it bounced down the dusty road toward the old camp, Johnson gave him mouth-to-mouth the entire way. The jeep had barely stopped when an enemy artillery round landed nearby, killing Sergeant Eugene Ashley and knocking Johnson unconscious. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of only a handful given for actions at a single Special Forces camp in the entire war. He never knew that the men he had been trying to reach were, at that very hour, still alive and about to save themselves. Inside the ruined operations bunker, Willoughby had regained consciousness during Ashley's final push. When it failed, he gathered what remained of his men. They had gone 18 hours without food or water. Convinced no more help was coming, he called in every airstrike he could, and at 1600 that afternoon led the survivors up the stairs one at a time in a dash for the supply bunker, Longrear in front, silencing an enemy position with a full magazine when the group came under fire 50 meters out. They made it. A jeep met them near the perimeter and carried them to the old camp, where Marine helicopters were already inbound. By 1730, every known survivor had been lifted out to Khe Sanh. The battle for Lang Vei was over. Of roughly 500 indigenous troops who had fought that night, more than 200 were dead or missing, 75 more wounded. Of the 24 Americans, 10 were dead or missing, 11 wounded. Almost every weapon and vehicle in the camp had been destroyed. Behind the survivors came nearly 6,000 people: Laotian soldiers, mountain tribesmen, South Vietnamese irregulars, civilians with nothing left, following the retreat to Khe Sanh's gate. The Marine base commander, fearing enemy soldiers had slipped into the crowd, refused to let them in. He took their weapons and held them outside the wire until Special Forces teams could screen every one of them by hand. It marked the first time in the Vietnam War that North Vietnamese armor had broken an American-held position. Some at Khe Sanh feared it meant their own base would fall next. It didn't. But nobody at Lang Vei that morning had needed a prophecy to know exactly what they had already lost. Nickolas Fragos survived the night. He spotted 5 tanks in the wire. He carried a grenade fragment in his elbow and a memory that never dimmed, the green flash of steel treads in flare light, the second before both sides opened fire. The question this story opened with was never really about the tanks. It was about the 8 kilometers between Lang Vei and Khe Sanh, and whether anyone would cross them in time. The honest answer is complicated. The Marines at Khe Sanh said no first, weighing their own siege against a camp they could not confirm was still alive. Westmoreland overruled them by morning, but the men who actually crossed that distance did it before any official order caught up to them. 100 Laotians and 3 Americans, led by a sergeant named Eugene Ashley, who reached the bunker line 4 times and paid for the 4th attempt with his life. He never got to see Willoughby's survivors walk out on their own that afternoon, 4 hours after his death, using the last daylight and a battered law and grenade defense to buy themselves the minutes they needed. The law that misfired in Fragos's hands that first hour, the one that fell short, the one that finally worked against a tank's rear plate at point-blank range. It was never a perfect weapon. It was simply the only one they had, and enough of them fired true when it counted. Lang Vei was the first camp in the Vietnam War where American Special Forces faced enemy armor and held their ground long enough to get out. It would not be the last time soldiers paid for a decision made somewhere else by men who were doing what they believed was right with the information they had. Sergeant Ashley's name is carved into a memorial today, one of the few men from that night whose story made it past the after-action report. Fragos's name mostly didn't. Neither did most of the CIDG soldiers who never came home from a camp that no longer exists. Fragos went home from Vietnam, still carrying that fragment of shrapnel in his elbow, a small, permanent piece of the night the tanks came. He rarely talked about the tower, or the flare, or the radio call. Some of the men who survived Lang Vei never talked about it at all. What they carried instead was quieter than a medal and heavier than one. The knowledge of exactly how close 8 kilometers can feel when it's the only thing standing between you and help that might not come in time.